Imagine your own child turning their back on you because of your humble beginnings. The one person you raised and sacrificed everything for suddenly denies you. This is the story of Edward and his father, Bamidele. What drove Edward to this? Keep watching to find out. Edward Bamidele grew up in the small dusty village of Ilesha with his father Bamidele. Bamidele was a widower, having lost his wife when Edward was just a child. He dedicated his life to ensuring Edward had everything he needed, taking on every available job, no matter how menial. Bamidele worked long hours in the fields, took on night shifts as a watchman, and even repaired old bicycles on weekend, also that Edward could have a shot at a better life. As soon as Edward turned 18, he told his father about his plan to move to Lagos, the bustling city of opportunity. Bamidele was initially hesitant, worried about his son facing the unknown dangers of city life. But seeing the determination in Edward's eyes, he decided to support him. Bamidele sold the little land they had, their modest house, and even his wife's cherished jewelry to give Edward the funds he needed to start a new life. With a heavy heart but hopeful spirit, Bamidele saw Edward off to the village bus stop. "Remember, son," Bamidele said, holding Edward's hands tightly, "no matter where you go or what you become, always stay true to yourself and to those who love you." Edward nodded, barely able to meet his father's gaze before boarding the bus that would take him away from the village, away from the only life he had ever known. Lagos was everything Edward had imagined: vast, noisy, and filled with opportunities. He started as an apprentice under a successful businessman, learning the ropes of importation and exportation. Edward worked tirelessly, his mind always on his future. Within a few years, his hard work paid off and he established his own business, quickly gaining reputation as a sharp and successful entrepreneur. One day, during a business trip to London, Edward met Adebimpe on a flight. She was elegant with a quiet confidence that captivated him instantly. They exchanged numbers and their connection blossomed quickly. Adebimpe came from a wealthy family, and the more Edward got to know her, the more he realized how different their backgrounds were. When Adebimpe invited Edward to meet her parents, he was both excited and terrified. The Ayodele family lived in a mansion in Ikoyi, one of the most influential neighborhoods in Lagos. As they entered the sprawling compound, Edward felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The grandeur of the house, the luxury cars parked in the driveway, and the impeccable manners of the staff all reminded him of how far he had come and how far he had left his road behind. During dinner, Adebimpe's father, Chief Ayodele, asked casually, "So Edward, what does your father do?" Edward froze, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, especially Adebimpe's. "My father is a successful businessman. He lives in Ikoyi as well, but is often traveling for work," he replied. Adebimpe beamed at him, her eyes filled with admiration. Edward felt a pang of guilt but quickly pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to lose her, not now, not after everything he had worked for. As their relationship deepened, Adebimpe expressed a desire to meet Edward's parents. Edward always found excuses. His parents were traveling, they were renovating their home, they were attending a family function abroad. But Adebimpe was persistent. Running out of lies, Edward devised a plan. He hired an elderly actor to pose as his father. The man was well-dressed, articulate and charming. When Adebimpe finally met him, she was impressed and Edward breathed a sigh of relief. The day of their introduction ceremony arrived, and it was a grand affair. Just as the ceremony was about to begin, an unexpected guest arrived, Tayo, an old friend from Edward's village. Tayo was shocked to see Edward, whom he knew from their days in Ilesha. He tried to catch Edward's eyes, but Edward pretended not to recognize him. Tayo, feeling uneasy, decided to send word to Bamidele about his son's upcoming wedding. Bamidele received the message with a mix of joy and confusion. He hadn't heard from Edward in years and didn't even know his son was getting married. With nothing but the clothes on his back, Bamidele made his way to Lagos. On the day of the wedding, as Edward stood at the altar, he saw a figure at the back of the church that made his blood run cold. It was his father, Bamidele, looking out of place in his simple clothes among the lavishly dressed guests. Edward quickly excused himself and hurried to the back. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, trying to keep his voice low. "Who invited you?" Bamidele looked at his son. "Edward, my son, I have missed you. Why did you tell me you were getting married? I had to hear it from a stranger." Edward's face twisted with anger and shame. "You shouldn't have come, Baba. These people, they are billionaires. They won't understand. They won't. They can't relate to someone like you. Bamidele's shoulders slumped as if a great weight had settled upon them. But I'm your father, Edward. I came to see you, to be with you on your big day. Edward sighed, frustration boiling over. Please go. Just go back to the village. I'll send some money. You don't belong here. Bamidele looked down at the invitation in his hand, the one that had brought him to Lagos, and slowly nodded. I understand, son. I don't want to embarrass you. I'll leave. As Bamidele turned to go, Edward grabbed his arm. Wait. Just stay out of sight. I'll come and visit you after the wedding. I promise. Bamidele nodded again, too heartbroken to argue. He stayed in the shadows, watching as another man took his place beside Edward at the altar, pretending to be his father. After the wedding, Bamidele returned to the village, but the pain of being rejected by his only son weighed heavily on him. Despite the cold reception and dismissal at the ceremony, Bamidele couldn't shake off the yearning to see his son, to be part of his life once more. One evening, after much contemplation, Bamidele made a decision. Clutching a small bag containing a few belongings and the little money he had left, he boarded a crowded bus headed for Lagos. Upon arriving in the bustling city, he navigated the chaotic street with determination, using the address he had obtained from Tayo, the family friend who had informed him about Edward's wedding. As he stood before the gates of Edward's lavish home, Bamidele couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and trepidation. His son had indeed made something of himself, but at what cost? Taking a deep breath, he approached the gate, spoke to the security guard. I am here to see Edward Adewale, Bamidele said politely. The security guard, suspicious of his simple attire, called Edward, who emerged from the house, annoyed. Baba, what are you doing here? Edward asked sharply, his eyes darting nervously around to ensure no one was watching. Bamidele smiled softly, unfazed by his son's tone. I came to see you, my son. It's been too long. I wanted to know how you're settling into married life. You shouldn't have come unannounced. I have a busy schedule, and this isn't a good time, Edward replied. I understand you are busy, but I won't take much of your time, Bamidele replied. I just wanted to see you, to know that you are well. Edward turned to his father with a stern expression. Listen, Papa, I appreciate your concern, but this is not appropriate. I will send you money whenever you need it, but please, don't come here again. My life here is complicated. A flicker of hurt crossed Bamidele's eyes, but he maintained his composure. Edward, money is not what I seek. I want to be part of your life, to know my son's happiness firsthand. Before Edward could respond, the sound of footsteps approached from behind. Edward, is everything okay? Came the soft, inquisitive voice of Adebimpe. Edward's body tensed as he turned around to see his wife approaching. Her eyes moved from Edward to Bamidele. Yes, everything is fine, Edward replied hastily, forcing a smile. I was just interviewing a potential gardener for the house. Bamidele's eyes widened slightly, but he remained silent. Adebimpe's face lit up with interest. Oh, wonderful! Our garden does need some tending. Have you tested his skills yet? Edward stammered, trying to find an excuse. Well, I was just about to. Perfect timing then, Adebimpe interjected warmly, turning to Bamidele with a kind smile. Sir, would you mind showing us your skills? Those rose bushes in the back have been neglected for a while. Bamidele nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken plea in Edward's eyes to play along. Of course, ma'am, I'll be happy to. Excellent, said Adebimpe. Come, I'll show you around. As they walked towards the backyard, Edward trailed behind, his mind racing with concern and frustration. In the expansive and meticulously designed backyard, Bamidele looked at the overgrown rose bushes and unkempt flower beds. Memories flooded back of his younger days when he would tend to the village gardens, earning extra money to support Edward's education. Bamidele handed him a pair of gardening shears and stood back to observe. Edward watched anxiously, hoping his father would not embarrass him further. With practiced ease, Bamidele began trimming the rose bushes. In no time, the once wild bushes were transformed into beautifully shaped structures and vibrant roses now prominently displayed. Adebimpe's eyes sparkled with admiration. This is amazing! You have such a skilled hand. The garden hasn't looked this good in ages. She turned to Edward with a satisfied grin. I think we have found our gardener. You are hired, sir. What's your name? Before Bamidele could respond, Edward interjected. Actually, Bamidele might not be available long term. It doesn't have any references or guarantor. Maybe we should look for someone through an agency. Adebimpe raised an eyebrow, sensing Edward's reluctance. Nonsense! His work speaks for itself. If he needs a guarantor, I'll be one. We need someone trustworthy and skilled, and clearly Bamdele fits the bill. Bamdele smiled gratefully. Thank you, ma'am. I will do my best to keep your garden beautiful. Wonderful. Let's get you settled then, Adebimpe said cheerfully. Edward looked flustered, struggling to find a way out of the situation. But Adebimpe already had her mind made up. As they walked back to the house, Edward pulled Bamdele aside briefly. This wasn't part of the plan, he whispered harshly. Bamdele met his gaze calmly. I only wish to be close to you, my son. Perhaps this is an opportunity. Inside the luxurious home, Adebimpe led them to the spacious kitchen where she offered Bamidele a seat and served him a glass of cold juice, much to Edward's discomfort. Thank you, ma'am, Bamidele said politely, taking a sip and savoring the refreshing taste. Please, come here, Adebimpe, she insisted warmly. Now, let's discuss your schedule and duties. We want you to feel comfortable here. As they went over the details, Edward sat silently, his mind churning with conflicting emotions. He was irritated by the unexpected turn of events, but also couldn't ignore the small spark of relief at having his father close, even under false pretenses. Later that evening, as Bamidele prepared to leave for the staff quarters, Adebimpe stopped him. Wait, Bamidele, there's a guest room available in the main house. You can stay there. No need to be all the way out in the quarters. Bamidele looked surprised. Ma'am, I don't want to impose. The staff quarters are perfectly fine. I insist, Adebimpe replied firmly. You are part of our household now, and I want you to be comfortable. Bamidele smiled gratefully. Thank you, Adebimpe, you are very kind. As the night settled in, Bamidele found himself in a comfortable, well-furnished room, a stark contrast to his humble home in Ilesha. He sat on the edge of the soft bed, gazing out the large window at the city lights, his heart filled with a mix of joy and sadness. Meanwhile, Edward paced in his study, frustration evident in his every movement. He couldn't understand why Adebimpe was so invested in this gardener and worried about the implication if the truth came out. Days turned into weeks and Bamidele settled into his new role seamlessly. Every morning he would rise early and tend to the gardens. His humble and kind nature quickly endeared him to the rest of the household staff, and even Edward found it harder each day to maintain his cold facade. Adebimpe, on the other hand, went out of her way to ensure Bamidele was well taken care of. She often invited him to share meals with them and engage him in conversations about his life and experiences. Edward grew increasingly uneasy with the growing bond between Adebimpe and Bamidele. One evening during dinner, he broached the subject. Adebimpe, don't you think you are getting a bit too familiar with the staff? He asked casually, cutting into his steak. She looked up, her expression neutral. What do you mean? I mean with Bamidele, he's a gardener, yet to treat him like a guest, it's not appropriate, Edward replied, trying to keep his tone light. Adebimpe's eyes narrowed slightly. I treat him with respect and kindness, Edward. Is there something wrong with that? Edward shrugged. It's just unusual, that's all. We have to maintain professional boundaries. She set her fork down, her gaze piercing. Perhaps if you took time to know him, you'll see what a remarkable person he is. Adebimpe studied him for a moment before speaking softly. Is there something you are not telling me? Edward looked up sharply. What do you mean? She sighed. Ever since Bamidele arrived, you have been on the edge, defensive even. I can't help but feel there is more to this. Edward forced a smile, shaking his head. You are imagining things. I'm just concerned about keeping our household running smoothly. Adebimpe didn't look convinced, but chose not to press further. All right, if you say so. As the evening wore on, Edward couldn't shake off the nagging worry that Adebimpe was onto him. He knew the charade couldn't last forever, but he wasn't ready to face the consequences of his deceit. One afternoon while tending to the garden, Bamidele slipped and fell, hitting his head hard on the stone pathway. He was rushed to the hospital where the doctors determined that he needed an urgent blood transfusion as he was bleeding out. Adebimpe, worried and desperate, called Edward. Edward, you need to get here now, she cried. Edward arrived at the hospital, his heart pounding with anxiety. What's going on? He asked as he approached Adebimpe. He needs blood transfusion, she explained. You need to donate blood or find someone whose blood is compatible. My father-in-law must not die. Edward froze, his mind reeling. What do you mean, father-in-law? He stammered. Adebimpe looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. Yes, Edward, I have known all along that Bamidele is your father. From the moment he came into our house, I knew. I overheard your conversation with him the first day he came. I knew Bamidele was your father all along, but I waited, hoping you would confess and make things right. I was so upset, wondering how you could deny him. How would you feel if your own son did the same to you? But this isn't the time to discuss that. We need to make sure that nothing happens to him. Edward was overwhelmed with guilt and regret. The lies he had built his life upon were crumbling. He realized that he couldn't run from his past any longer. Desperate to save his father, Edward agreed to the blood transfusion. As Edward laid on the hospital bed, watching the blood flow from his arm into the IV that would save his father's life, tears streamed down his face. He realized that no amount of wealth or status could ever replace the bond between father and son. Bamidele survived the accident, and as he recovered, Edward knew that he had to make amends. Baba, Edward called softly, his voice trembling. Bamidele turned to look at him. Edward, is everything all right? Edward sat beside him, his eyes reflecting regret and sorrow. No, Baba, everything is not all right. I have wronged you in so many ways, and I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I must ask for it. Bamidele's eyes softened, his voice gentle. Son, you don't have to. Please let me speak, Edward interrupted. I have been a terrible son. I let my pride and fear drive a wedge between us. I denied you, lied about my past, and pushed you away when all you ever did was love and support me. Tears streamed down Edward's face as he continued. You sacrificed everything for me, and I repaid you with rejection and dishonor. I am sorry, Baba. I understand if you can never forgive me, but I want you to know how truly sorry I am. Bamidele's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he placed a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. Edward, my son, there is nothing to forgive. A father's love is unconditional. I have always been proud of you, and all I've ever wanted is your happiness. Edward looked up flickering in his eyes. Can we start over? Can I be the son you deserve? Bamidele smiled warmly, pulling Edward into a tight embrace. We can and we will. The past is behind us, and together we can build a better future. They held each other for a long moment, the years of distance and pain melting away under the warmth of their renewed bond. From the balcony, Adebimpe watched the heartfelt reunion, a satisfied smile gracing her lips. The following days were filled with joy and reconciliation. Edward formally introduced Bamidele as his father to Adebimpe's family, admitting his past mistakes and seeking their understanding. To his surprise and relief, they accepted Bamidele graciously, appreciating Edward's honesty. Bamidele moved from the guest room to a more permanent space in the house, becoming an integral part of their family life. He continued to tend the garden, not as a gardener, but as a beloved patriarch, nurturing beauty and life around him. Thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed listening to this story as much as I enjoyed telling it to you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, stay kind and be blessed.